All right, class. Today we are going to finish up talking about the Civil War over Chapter 15. We're going to go from the Battle of Gettysburg all the way to Appomattox Courthouse. So let's dive right in and talk about Gettysburg, right? The turning point of the Civil War, because before this, the Confederacy was doing really, really well. They were winning all the major battles. If you look at Bull Run, and you look at Second Bull Run, and you look at Fredericksburg, and you look at Chancellorsville, these are all Confederate victories against larger Union forces. And of course, the North had a very difficult time finding a general that they could trust to win battles. McClellan had been removed, and Burnside had been removed, and Hooker had been removed. And so now it was General Meade that will be the general that is in charge of the Army of the Potomac going into Gettysburg. Now, Robert E. Lee has been obviously very victorious, and now he is planning to invade the North once again. His first attempt, when he attacked at Antietam, didn't go as planned. This time he feels that they need to have a northern victory, that if he can get between, if he can force the Army of the Potomac to come out to one big battle and threaten Washington, D.C., okay, well then maybe the North will have to sue for peace. And so that's kind of the rationalization behind this. Now, of course, he's going to be doing this without his chief advisor, if you will, with Stonewall Jackson having been killed after the Battle of Chancellorsville. And so one of the things that Lee knows, though, is that the South cannot continue to fight a war like this for another 2 or 3 years, that they just can't replace the men the way the North can. All right, and so they need a victory on northern soil. And so they march up into the north. They make the turn south towards D.C., and from that point forward, pretty much it seems all roads kind of converge onto Gettysburg. All right, now Gettysburg is going to be fought over the course of 3 days. The first day, it starts kind of as a minor skirmish between Union cavalry led by General Buford and, of course, then portions of the Confederate Army. But as the day progresses, the battle gets bigger and bigger as more troops are coming in from the north, and the Confederacy begins to put themselves in position. They actually fight through the town, and then south of the town there is kind of a dominating geographical feature. There is a ridge, really 2 ridges. The first ridge is going to be Seminary Ridge, and that's where the Confederacy will set up. And then there'll be Cemetery Ridge, in which the Union will be set up. All right, and Cemetery Hill in particular kind of dominates the town, just on the outskirts of town. And had the Confederacy been able to capture that hill, which it seemed like they had the opportunity to do so, the battle could have been a whole lot different. But as it was at the end of day 1, the Union was on Cemetery Hill, while the ridge that extended out, and the Confederacy was on Seminary Ridge. All right, so now day 2. Lee is planning an attack on day 2. And so if the bottom of your screen here is like the Seminary Ridge area, and the top of your screen is where the Union is, the whole idea is that they attack the edges of the Union line. All right, so coordinated attack against Cemetery Hill, which would be on this side over here, and then the Round Tops on this side. Now the Round Tops, Little and Big Round Top, really were not guarded that well, and in fact it's going to be late in the day when the Union finally put some troops on Little Round Top, and this is where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain becomes famous with the 20th Maine and holding that position as they were the end of the line, and wave after wave after wave of Confederate attacks up Little Round Top to that position occurred late in the day of day 2, only to have the 20th Maine be able to hold the line. Had they lost that line and had to retreat, then the line would have been flanked. It would have been very difficult to turn those armies and face the Confederacy as they rushed through. So it was a huge stand by the 20th Maine. And in fact, at one point they pretty much ran out of ammunition, and Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge. They fixed the bayonets onto the guns, and they sprinted down the hill at the Confederates. They left their position and attacked late in the day, which was kind of the final charge of the day against the Union. But when the day was over, the Union had held their position even though they were very, very close to breaking. And it was tremendous fighting through the wheat field and the peach orchard and the Devil's Den, all these very famous landmarks of the Gettysburg battlefield. And so day 3 comes along, and one of Lee's confidants, General Longstreet, wanted to move the army and say, let's go fight somewhere else. They have the high ground, if you will. But Lee felt like the Union almost broke on day 1, that they almost broke on day 2, and that day 3 was going to be their day. So instead of attacking the edges, they're going to kind of spread their line out and then go and attack the center of the Union line. All right, and so this is going to be led by General George Pickett. Pickett had been in reserve. He is now going to lead, his division is going to lead this charge on day 3. And so, it's over this open ground. It's about 3/4 to a mile in length from where the Seminary Ridge area is to where they're going to be attacking on Cemetery Ridge. And so, when it was all said and done at the end of the day, it was a slaughter. The Union was able to hold their position. They had a stone wall. The Confederacy did get beyond that stone wall and fight for a brief period of time, but they will be quickly pushed back. And in the end, Pickett's division is decimated as he loses 8 of 11 commanders. The casualties are extremely high at the end of day 3, mainly, of course, on the Confederate side. And so now, Lee has no other choice but to retreat. And as he's trying to retreat, the rains begin to fall, the Potomac gets flooded. He's pretty well trapped in the north, and yet Meade doesn't pursue, which is very, very aggravating to Lincoln. And by the time Meade does, the river has rescinded. The Confederacy is across the Potomac back into Southern territory. And once again, an opportunity has kind of left the Union to end this war in an immediacy. But Gettysburg's a turning point because at this point, there really is no major victories for the Confederacy. They will win some battles, but they will not win major victories like they had early on. And one of the things that happens here is that Meade will be replaced then with Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant takes a much different approach. Grant is much more along the line of you have to be willing to sacrifice a lot of men in order to win this war. And as horrific as that sounds, it was a game changer for the Union because Grant will go into the South. He will lose a battle as far as the amount of men, if you will. And usually that would mean, we're going to retreat. But Grant didn't retreat. He just brought up more reserves and he attacked, the next day or the next week. And he kept attacking. And Lee knew that this was a bad sign, that finally the Union had a general who was going to do what it took to win the war. Okay, and so you have battles like the Wilderness and Cold Harbor and Spotsylvania, very heavy casualty battles in which the Union will lose more men than the Confederacy, but they could bring up more reserves. And so the Confederate Army begins to dwindle through 1864. All right, so now we begin to move towards late 1864, and Lee knows they're in trouble. All right, he's just trying to hold on, trying to last long enough to get through the 1864 election in the hope that maybe Lincoln will be replaced. General McClellan is running against Lincoln, and he's talking about maybe ending this war, coming to some sort of conclusion. And so Lee's hoping, well, maybe if we can last through the election, and maybe if Lincoln's replaced, maybe still there's hope. And so it was a toss-up going into the summer of 1864 because people were tired of the casualties and the losses and such. And there seemed to be, no real end in sight. But then a couple things happened. One will be William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman will begin his total war in the South and beginning to burn farm fields and destroy livestock and tear up rail lines. And he captures Atlanta. September of 1864, he captures Atlanta, and that pretty much solidifies the idea that, this war will come to an end within a year, that people begin to see a light at the end of the tunnel. And so that's a huge factor for Lincoln winning re-election. And so once Lincoln wins re-election in 1864, Lee knows that he's in big trouble, and he sets up at Petersburg. And the Grant's army begins to lay siege to Petersburg in the fall of 1864. Meanwhile, farther south, Sherman, after taking Atlanta and burning that city, marches to Savannah in the March to the Sea, where again destroying anything that might help the Confederacy in their fight. So by 1865, the spring of 1865, Lee's army is holed up at Petersburg. The South is being decimated by Sherman and his army. General Sheridan's going through the Shenandoah Valley and wreaking havoc there. The Mississippi is controlled by the Union. The war is pretty much coming to a close. It's just a matter of when. Lee is able to get out of Petersburg as he makes his way to trying to get to Appomattox, where there is a rail junction that will help to supply his army, and maybe he can keep this going. But as he gets to Appomattox, he finds that the Union Army has already beaten him there. There's no resupplying. And so it's at this point that Lee realizes there's no real reason to continue fighting. And so he sends a letter over to Grant saying that he will be willing to accept Grant's terms of surrender, that he would accept what Grant has laid out as the terms of surrender. And so here at Appomattox Courthouse, General Grant accepts Lee's surrender. And Grant, ever understanding of what was happening here, knew that once this war was over, these men were going to be Americans again. They weren't going to be Confederate state citizens, that they were going to be American citizens. And so he was pretty gracious. The idea that, hey, if you have a gun, it's your gun, take it home with you. If it's your horse, take your horse. That we're not here to necessarily lay out punishment, but of course they marched away. He also told his men no cheering, no gloating with this surrender, that these are your countrymen now. And so kind of understanding the gravity of the situation there at the end. And so at this point too, Lincoln had been pushing to get the 13th Amendment passed, which is, again, outlawing slavery. So we had the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. By 1865, he had pushed for the 13th Amendment to be passed. And so that is going to be part of what we now look at as the reconstruction of the country. And so for the next week, a little less, Lincoln is able to enjoy the fact that the war is over, that the 13th Amendment is passed. But of course, shortly after this, we're going to talk then about the Lincoln assassination and the reconstruction of the United States. And that'll be the last video of the year. So until that time, stay safe.